developed in this book was a response to what he perceived as the inadequacy in prevailing microeconomic models to account for events such as Great Depression. In recognition of Keynes' economic contribution, the resulting model of the economy is often called the Keynesian model. According to Keynesian theory, the effect of short-run fluctuation in the level of economic activity can be summarized in terms of interaction between aggregate demand, AD curve, and the short-run aggregate supply, ASSR curve, as illustrated in Figure 54. In addition to the short-run aggregate supply curve, the diagram also includes a long-run aggregate supply curve, which is shown as a vertical line at the point y equals y star, that is, where output equals potential output. In this diagram, the horizontal axis measures the real GDP, and the vertical axis measures the aggregate price level. The diagram looks quite similar to the demand and supply diagrams we used before to analyze individual markets, but it is important to understand that the reasons for the shape of AD and ASSR curves are entirely different from the demand and supply curve we have considered up to now. The aggregate demand curve. We will begin by considering the derivation of the aggregate demand curve. Recall that in the conventional analysis of a single market, the quantity demanded increased as the price fell, primarily because the lower price meant that the good in question has become less expensive relative to other goods. For example, as price of bagels falls, they became a better bargain relative to muffins, and people will buy fewer muffins and more bagels. At the level of aggregate economy, however, such an explanation no longer makes sense, since a decline in aggregate price level means that the price of all goods and services have declined. If shifts in relative prices doesn't account for the downward sloping aggregate demand curve, then what does? There are three reasons for the negative relationship between the aggregate demand and the aggregate price level. Wealth effects. With a fixed supply of money, when the aggregate price level declines, the money that people have in their wallet and bank accounts will allow them to purchase a greater quantity of goods and services. Lower prices, in effect, increase their wealth and encourage a higher level of spending. Notice that this conclusion follows directly from the quantity equation that we introduced earlier. M times V equals P times Y. If the velocity of money, V, doesn't change and the quantity of money in the economy is consistent, then the lower price level must lead to a higher level of real GDP. Interest rate effects. At a lower price level, people will find that they are holding more money than they want to have. As we saw when we analyzed demand for and supply of money, when people are holding more money than they view as optimal, they will attempt to reduce their monetary assets by using their money to acquire less liquid assets, including bank certificates of deposit, stocks, and bonds. All these actions increase the supply of savings. Increased saving causes interest rate to fall and encourage households and firms to borrow more funds and increase their spending. Foreign exchange effects. The third channel through which lower aggregate price level affects aggregate demand is exports. At a lower domestic price level, domestically produced goods and services are less expensive relative to foreign purchased goods. As a result, the domestic consumers will buy fewer imported goods and services, and foreign consumers will purchase more domestically produced goods and services, causing net exports to increase. Now that we have explained the downward slope of the aggregate demand curve in Figure 54, we can consider the factors that influence its position. Anything that influences the consumption decisions of households or foreign residents, or leads firms to increase the investment, will cause the aggregate demand curve to shift. The introduction of promising new technology such as high-speed satellite internet will cause some firms to increase investment spending. For instance, Elon Musk's SpaceX company is manufacturing over 100 internet satellites per month on its way to building a network with 12,000 satellites that will be able to provide internet from orbit to anywhere in the world. Such an increase in investment spending increases the aggregate demand at every price level and causes the AD to shift to the right. Similarly, the changes in consumer sentiment will affect consumption spending and will shift the AD curve. For example, a drop in stock prices such as occurred in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis, reduce wealth and cause consumers to reduce their level of spending at every level. Such change would be reflected as a leftward shift of the AD curve. The AD curve can also be shifted by changes in government spending or taxes. An increase in spending by federal government will, other things being equal, increase spending at every price level, a change that can be illustrated in the rightward shift of the AD curve. When state government reduces spending by furloughing employees, as some did during the recession of 2007 to 2009, this reduces spending and shifts the AD curve to the left. When the government reduces taxes, it increases households' disposable income, which should increase consumption spending, which will shift the AD curve to the right. It is worth mentioning that the effect of tax change is difficult to predict because consumers don't always spend the extra money. Some might save it or use it to pay off debt, and neither of these actions will affect the AD curve. The aggregate supply curve. In Figure 54, the aggregate supply curve is drawn as upward sloping, indicating that the quantity of goods and services supplied is an increasing function of the aggregate price level. Once again, while the shape of aggregate supply curve is similar to the supply curves we encountered earlier in our microeconomic analysis of market for particular goods, it is upward sloping for different reasons. In the microeconomic analysis of markets, the supply curve was upward sloping because the higher prices are necessary to attract resources from producing other products. For example, in the market for bagels, as the price of bagels increase, bakers who are previously producing muffins will be introduced to shifts over bagel production. At the aggregate level, however, resources cannot be shifted from other less profitable activities. As we noted at the beginning of our discussion of short-run economic fluctuations, many firms do not immediately adjust prices in response to variations in demand. Instead, they fix prices for some period of time as they sell as much or as little as consumers choose to purchase. Over time, firms adjust their prices in response to the gap between actual and anticipated sales. The aggregate supply curve slopes upward to reflect the relationship between price adjustment process and the size of unanticipated sales. The position of aggregate supply curve depends on the economy's long-run potential output and on what people expect the aggregate price level to be. The short-run aggregate supply curve will pass through the vertical line at Y star at a price level equal to the prevailing expectation about our aggregate prices. Resources will be fully employed, and the aggregate supply will equal to its long-run potential output, Y star, in our earlier discussion, when the aggregate price level is equal to the level that firms and consumers anticipated. Thus, there are several reasons for the short-run aggregate supply curve to shift. The first and the most common cause of shifts in the position of aggregate supply curve is the changes in expected price level. Since ASSR is equal to Y star at the expected aggregate price level, an increase in expected price level will cause the aggregate supply curve to shift leftward. A decrease in expected price level will cause the aggregate supply to shift rightward. Some other factors will shift the short-run aggregate supply curve are input prices, tax policy, government regulations, new technologies, and changes to productivity. A major cause of shifts in the aggregate supply curve is the aggregate supply shocks. For example, climate conditions that affect agricultural production may shift the aggregate supply curve. An especially good harvest means that there are more agricultural commodities available at every price, an event that would cause aggregate supply curve to shift rightward. An important example of a shock aggregate supply in recent history is the OPEC-initiated oil embargo that began in 1973. Because of the importance of fossil fuel as a resource of power throughout the economy, the shortage of imported oil has a widespread effect on the U.S. economy, causing the reduction in quantities supplied at every price, and a leftward shift in the short-run aggregate supply curve. In addition to those movements of the short-run aggregate supply curve, technological process will cause economy's potential output to shift out to the right over time. It is this increase in potential output that accounts for the long-run growth of real GDP, as we noted at the beginning of this section of the resource guide. The Keynesian model of short-run fluctuations. At any point, the Keynesian model implies that the economy's aggregate production and price level are determined by the intersection of AD and ASSR. Figure 54 is drawn so that this intersection occurs at a point where actual output is equal to its potential, so the output gap is zero. At this point, there is no cyclical unemployment, and resources are being fully employed. But if aggregate supply or aggregate demand curve were to shift for some reason, the intersection of two curves would be either above or below the potential output. We will begin by illustrating the effect of a negative aggregate demand shock. In December 2007, the United States economy went into a deep recession as a result of a mortgage lending crisis. Many consumers has taken on risky subprime mortgages to buy homes were unable to repay them. These widespread foreclosures triggered a banking crisis that led to a significant decrease in consumption and business investment spending. Government spending increased to try to fill the gap, but the end result was the Great Recession. In panel A of figure 55, we show the combined effect of these events as a leftward shift in the AD curve. As a result, the economy's short-run equilibrium now occurs at y1, which is less than y star. The economy is now in a recession because of the shift in the consumer sentiment. As the equilibrium point in figure 55 shifts down and to the left along the ASSR curve, some business lower their prices, and the aggregate price level begins to decline, a response that moderates the impact of the shift in the consumer sentiment. Panel B of figure 55 illustrates the adjustment of the economy as it begins to recover from recession. The position of the aggregate supply curve in figure 55A indicates that businesses and households were expecting the price to be at P0. Since this is where the curve passes through the point where y equals y star, however, the actual price level, P1, is now below P0. As time passes and firms find that they are selling less, they begin to adjust their expectations about the aggregate price level downward. As a result, the decline in prices output has increased to y2, but it is still below the potential output. Prices will continue to fall until the AD and ASSR curve once again intersect at the point where output equals potential y star. In figure 56, we illustrate the recession caused by an aggregate supply shock, such as OPEC oil embargo of 1973. The shortage of petroleum and higher prices of gasoline and other products are shown in figure 56A. As a leftward shift of the ASSR curve, beginning at the point y equals y star and the price level P0, output falls to y1, and the aggregate price level rises to P1. With the economy in recession, firms find that actual sales are falling short of expectations. Eventually, they will begin to cut prices, causing the ASSR curve to shift out to the right. This movement is illustrated in figure 56B. Prices will fall until output once again equals potential. At this point, the price level would have returned to the original level at P0. Figure 55 and 56 illustrate the basic expectation of recessions and expansions in the Keynesian model. Recessions and expansions occur because of the sequence of unpredictable shocks to aggregate demand or aggregate supply that strike the economy and cause the equilibrium level of production to move away from its potential. The reason these shocks are translated into recessions or expansions is because of the short-run inflexibility of prices. If prices everywhere in the economy adjusted instantly to the effect of shocks, then output would never differ from the potential. This is the short-run inflexibility of prices that is the basic explanation for recessions and expansions. You will notice that up until now, we have been somewhat vague about the period of time that is represented by the short run. This is because the definition of short run is effectively the period of time in which the performances of the economy deviates from the prediction of the long-run model. Judging from the length of the typical economic cycles, this is usually 1 to 3 years. Inflation in the Keynesian model. The model of recession and expansion we have sketched out so far has assumed that the level of inflation in the economy is zero. That is, we have drawn the AD and ASSR curve on the assumption that everyone believes the aggregate price level is stable. We have seen, however, that since the Second World War, the aggregate price level has followed a generally upward trend. Moreover, as the previous section demonstrated, the process of adjustment by which the economy returns to full employment after a shock involves changing the price level. To begin with, we need to ask why economy would be experiencing persistent inflation. The quantity equation implies that in the long run, the aggregate price level can rise only if the money supply is growing faster than the economy's potential output. Suppose, for example, that because of technological change, potential output increases 2% per year, and the stock of money increases at 5% per year. The quantity equation can be rearranged to show the price level must equal n times v divided by y star. So long as velocity is constant, prices will raise by 3%, equals 5% minus 2% each year. In the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, the increase in the money supply causes the AD curve to shift to the right. But if people has become accustomed to the increased money supply and rising prices, they will expect the price level to rise each year, and the ASSR curve will shift upward so that the AD and ASSR continue to intersect at the economy's potential output. This is illustrated in Figure 57. Thus, full employment equilibrium is consistent with any anticipated level of inflation. In this context, unexpected shocks that move the economy away from the full employment causes actual inflation to deviate from the anticipated level. For example, suppose that the federal government decides to begin a military buildup, but chooses to finance it through borrowing because it is afraid that increasing taxes will be unpopular. This is roughly what happened in the 1960s under President Lyndon Johnson. The increased government spending causes output to increase precisely because it is not anticipated. In the long run, however, there is no policy that will maintain the output at a level different from the economy's potential output. Thus, when we use the aggregate demand supply model, we need to remember that changes in aggregate prices that it indicates unanticipated deviation from the prevailing and expected rates of inflation. Using fiscal and monetary policy to stabilize the economy. The adjustment of aggregate price level when output differs from potential suggests that economy has a natural tendency to return to a situation in which resources are fully employed. Such an adjustment can, however, take a year or more to significantly affect the economy, an effect that leads many economists to argue that fiscal or monetary policy measures should be used to help speed up adjustment process. Nevertheless, the use of activist policies remain controversial, and a significant number of economists believe that such interventions are generally counterproductive. We will begin here by describing how the government affects the short-run equilibrium in the economy, and that we will discuss arguments for and against intervention. As we have seen, total expenditure in the economy are described by the equation y equals c plus I plus g plus nx. The term G stands for government purchases of goods and services. If shifts in the household business spending and the net exports reduce expenditures, increased government spending can be used to make up the shortfall in aggregate demand. Increased government spending or expansionary fiscal policy is one form of intervention that should offset recession and restore full employment. Fiscal policy can also be used indirectly to increase spending through tax cuts. Lower taxes with constant level of government spending means that consumers have a higher level of disposable income. Higher income would encourage increased consumer spending and cause AD curve to shift to the right, thus mitigating the effect of recession. In addition to fiscal policy, the Federal Reserve can use monetary policy instruments to offset short-run economic fluctuations. By varying the amount of money held in bank reserves, the Federal Reserve can influence the Fed funds rate. And, as we have seen, changes in the Fed funds rate can affect the level of both investment and consumption spending. If the economy is producing above potential output, a situation that would cause inflationary pressures, the Federal Reserve can help to reduce consumption and investment spending by increasing the amount of money held in bank reserves and encouraging an increase in the Fed funds rate. Conversely, if the economy is in recession, decreasing the bank reserves will encourage a lower Fed funds rate and stimulate additional consumption and investment spending. The main argument in favor of using monetary or fiscal policy to stabilize the economy is that deviation of actual output from potential output are costly. In recessions, when some resources are not fully employed, the economy forever loses the output that those resources could not have produced. Moreover, unemployment imposes significant hardship on those who lose their jobs or see their income reduced. When the output is above potential, inflation will accelerate. We have seen that inflation is costly for a variety of reasons. Controversy about the desirability of fiscal and monetary policy interventions arises for two reasons. The first is the difficulty of identifying precisely what the economy potential output is, and thus the difficulty in determining when interventions are needed. The second and more significant concern centers on the practicality of carrying out such fiscal and monetary policy effectively. One of the biggest challenges that economic policymakers face is the information about the aggregate economy takes time to collect. It takes about 3 months to calculate the first estimate of GDP, and these estimates are subject to substantial revision over the next few months. As additional data becomes available, other data are available more quickly, but almost all economic information has the same lags, meaning that policymakers must act on partial, incomplete evidence about the state of economy. Moreover, the effects of their action takes time to be felt. When interest rates are reduced, for example, it may take many months for business to undertake new investment projects, and since they often require considerable planning, efforts to increase government spending operate with even longer lags. It can easily take 6 months or a year from the time Congress authorizes additional spending until the projects are eventually undertaken. So even if Congress acts quickly, which is not usually the case, the additional spending may not begin to take effect until the economy has already begun to recover. If the effects of increased government spending begin to be felt only after the economy begins to recover on its own, they may cause the economy to overshoot full employment and contribute to inflationary pressures rather than mitigating the effect of the recession. For this reason, many economists believe that activist policies are likely to be counterproductive as to be helpful. End of section 3.